Hello and welcome to our tutorial on relatively difficult concepts in film theory. And today we're going to be talking about cinematic and cultural invisibility. Of the two, cinematic invisibility is perhaps the easiest to understand. Films, of course, aren't invisible, or else why would we go to them? But we tend not to notice the typical cinematic techniques, such as generally keeping the camera at eye level using shot, reverse shot, or over the shoulder, or point of view shots. And it just becomes kind of invisible, natural, the way we expect to see things, even if it's in a goofy Lego movie. Subtle high and low angles like this one here, where we're looking down on the character, leads us to suspect that this character is vulnerable, so that we're not entirely surprised that there's somebody waiting at the top of the stairs to knife him in the face. Move the camera to a position relatively low to the subject, and we lend that subject, here of course the Joker from The Dark Knight, a sense of power. So these techniques become common and expected, and therefore kind of invisible. Here an over the shoulder shot, here an eye level shot, and so on. And so again, these are techniques that we see so often that we just don't notice them. Another very important aspect of cinematic invisibility is editing. And we've just had 3 shots, and we probably didn't recognize that. The first shot showed an action, the second, a reaction, and we begin to see the man moving his arm up, and there's a cut on action, which all seems to us to be sort of natural and therefore, again, invisible. In The Matrix, we can see the same invisible editing techniques being used again. Here, Neo's being asked to open his coat. We get a cut to see that he's carrying a lot of guns, a reaction shot, all at eye level, and another reaction shot, several, in fact, in a row. And so we tend to get caught up in the story and don't notice all the editing that's going on. Another very important aspect of cinematic invisibility is that the camera and crew and equipment is really kept from our view. Shots are framed so that we don't notice the microphones, the lighting equipment, and focus instead on the story. To wrap it up, just keep in mind that we tend not to notice things like camera angle or editing techniques because we get so involved with the story. And so tend not also to be aware of the crew behind the scenes because the focus is always on the story. But in any case, if you have any questions, be sure to take another look at the chapter, particularly the discussion of Juno, or send me an email. Now, though, I'd like to move on to cultural invisibility. As our textbook puts it, cultural invisibility is, quote, the implied political, cultural, and ideological messages that help make the movie so appealing. Let's break this down and begin with the word implied. Implied, of course, is related to implicit, and implicit is the opposite of explicit. Explicit, in terms of a film, is basically what's happening in the story on a very literal level. It's quite clearly there on the surface. On the other hand, something that's implicit isn't directly stated or not obviously seen, and you have to do a little bit of digging, particularly when looking for cultural invisibility. Okay, final term from our definition. Ideology is often used to get at the political dimensions of our cultural life, and oftentimes in a negative sense, like saying that, oh, that's just Democratic, Republican, Socialist, or whatever ideology, kind of used as a substitute for propaganda. And sometimes those messages can be explicitly ideological, as we saw in the 2016 debate, or those messages might be more implicit, as with the film Get Out, which deals with race relationships in the guise of a horror film. But in any case, I've thrown quite a few terms at you. Let's see if we can put some of this to work. To flesh out these terms, let's take a look at a clip from the film Animal Farm, which many of you may have read in high school. And it explicitly tells the story of a group of animals who decide to overthrow the cruel farmer and take over the farm to create a more egalitarian society. The revolution doesn't go as all the animals planned, however, and soon the pigs begin to take over and begin acting, in fact, a lot like human beings, giving themselves awards, selling other animals for food, dining with human beings and dressing like human beings, and so forth. And that's pretty much what's going on the explicit level of the novel and film. On the implicit level, though, and I say this because the film never mentions Russia or communism or Joseph Stalin, the film is very much a critique of the Russian Revolution, which ended up going very much against its tenets and exterminating, in fact, millions of their own people under Stalin. And the film and novel both use the communist created idea of the capitalistic pig against communism. And this understanding, this implicit meaning, really deepens our experience, enriches it, of the film and novel both. So discussing what happens explicitly in a film is really pretty simple. We describe what is going on in the film. And here from John Carpenter's film They Live, we see a man put on a pair of glasses and in the process transform these images in advertising to something different. So in a way, you could argue that culture, the culture we're born into, gives us a kind of lens through which to see the world, certain expectations and cultural beliefs and so on. And finding implicit meaning means putting on a new set and beginning to try to see things differently. And when you do so, you begin to find these messages everywhere. And they are sometimes contradictory, but nevertheless quite interesting. Some aspects of our cultural belief systems are, of course, very visible in terms of dress and clothing and rituals that we observe and so forth. And others are not quite so clear. The idea of communication styles and particularly beliefs and values. So again, it takes a bit of digging. When we look at films from other times or cultures, these things begin to become more prominent, and we notice that our cultural values and ideas aren't universally shared or timeless. But regardless of what film you're watching, for cultural invisibility, a good place to begin is to look at power, particularly the distribution of power in terms of race, class, age, and gender. The woman that we saw moments ago in They Live, for example, in the Come to the Caribbean ad, is very stereotypical in maybe somewhat not so powerful ways. We see this woman reproduced in various forms in ads over and over again, advocating certain body types that are acceptable and not for women in our culture. Which isn't to say that these stereotypes go uncontested, as we can see here with this Dove ad, which attempts to broaden the idea of what beauty means for a woman in terms of race and gender and even age. And sometimes when we see these gender stereotypes worked out, we are sometimes a little bit shocked or perhaps humored by the way that the culture continues to talk to itself through movies, films, and advertisements. It's also interesting to note that it wasn't until 2018 with Wonder Woman that the first woman superhero was unleashed upon the film world. And this was also interesting because it was directed by a woman, which is very uncommon in Hollywood. That same year brought us Black Panther, which was the first movie to feature a black superhero in the leading role of a film. And this too played very well with critics and audiences alike. So I hope you begin to see that looking at a film in terms of its cultural statements, which could be culturally invisible, can help to enrich our understanding of not only the film, but of our culture. So begin maybe taking a look not only at cinematic invisibility, but also cultural invisibility, remembering that even if filmmakers don't intend for these shared or contested belief systems to be mirrored in these films, they can certainly be interesting and instructive. So start taking a closer look and see what you discover. I'll see you next time.